Hello, and welcome to my Indo European series. Unlike what you might think, this video is not the beginning of this series. I actually started this series a year ago, back in May 2021. But I had only posted one video for it before this one, and that was back in last September, 9 months ago. So it's been a long time since I've done anything for this series, but I'm here to tell you that I am now back, and I am super serious this time. This right here is a new Indo European video, and I have several more planned after this one, which I promise you I will get done. Now, as I get started on this series again, I want to remind you of what its purpose is. And this purpose should get you guys who are Indo European enthusiasts excited to watch my videos. So the purpose of this series is not to do what most people do when they talk about Indo European DNA, which is just repeat what the Harvard lab says. If you didn't know, the Harvard lab is the main lab which sequences Indo European ancient DNA, and they are therefore the authoritative voice on what it means. And so what most people do when they talk about Indo European DNA is just repeat what they say. But that's not what I'm going to do in this series. The purpose of this series is quite the opposite. It is to disprove the Harvard lab, to challenge the Harvard lab, to come after the Harvard lab. This is not because I think they get everything wrong. No, they have gotten the most fundamental thing about Indo-European origins correct, which is that their ancient DNA proves that Indo-European languages were spread by a race from Eastern Europe, whom I refer to as the Kurgans. You guys know that they refer to them as Steppe people. That's the name you know them by. But other than that, they've gotten pretty much everything wrong. Well, not completely wrong. They've gotten everything else besides that, at least partially wrong. And these mistakes they have made have given you guys, who are Indo-European enthusiasts, a flawed storyline of Indo-European origins, which has really frustrated me. So what I want to do in this series is correct their mistakes and therefore give you guys a more accurate account of Indo-European origins. But not just that, I also want to share with you brand new discoveries that I and other amateurs have made, but which the Harvard lab has not made. So overall, the purpose of this series is to give you a more accurate and updated account of Indo-European origins than the Harvard lab gives you. And yeah, this purpose should get you guys who are Indo-European enthusiasts pumped up, excited to watch the videos of my series. Because, you've heard what the Harvard lab has to say for the past 7 years. They've been saying basically the same thing year after year after year for the past 7 years. And even if you agree with them, you've probably wanted to hear a new perspective. You've probably wanted to hear at least someone claim to have new discoveries. And you're going to get that in this series. Okay, now with that out of the way, let's get started on this video. In this video, the claim from the Harvard lab that I will disprove is the claim that they make about who the people were that spread the Indo-European languages. Now remember what I said a few moments ago. They're right about what race spread the Indo-European languages. This is the race from Eastern Europe, whom I refer to as the Kurgans. But what they're wrong about is what specific member or members of this race did it. What they claim is that it was just one member named Yamnaya who did it all by themselves without any help from any other Kurgans. This is wrong. Yamnaya did not do it all by themselves. Yes, they did spread some Indo-European languages, but they had help from another group of Kurgans named Ware. But before I tell you why I believe this, I need to mention that this claim that the Harvard lab makes that Yamnaya did it all by themselves, that Yamnaya were the Proto-Indo Europeans, is not just one of many claims they have made. It is the principal claim that they have made. When they speak to the public about their work, like for example, when they do presentations in front of other scholars at universities, it's pretty much all they talk about. They basically say, hey guys, we've been sequencing some Indo-European ancient DNA, and the big thing we have discovered is that the Yamnaya culture was almost definitely the Proto-Indo European culture. And this is something that pretty much everyone has accepted. It's totally a consensus. Most other scholars have accepted it. Most Indo-European enthusiasts, including most of you guys, have accepted it. So me coming here in this video and saying that this is wrong is controversial. It's exciting. It should get you guys excited to watch this video. Even if you agree with this claim by the Harvard lab, you've got to at least wonder, why is it that I disagree. Okay, now here's why I disagree. The reason why I disagree is I do not believe that Yamnaya is the ancestor of corded ware. Who is corded ware? Corded ware were the Indo Europeans who spread into Northern Europe. They're the source of Indo European languages there, but actually, they're the source of most Indo European languages as a whole, because they would spread from the north to other regions as well. This was actually the topic of my first video of this series, which I posted last September. It's something that the Harvard Lab has not figured out yet, which is why I made a video about it. Anyways, I don't believe Yamnaya is corded ware's ancestor. Therefore, I don't believe Yamnaya is the ancestor of all Indo Europeans. Corded ware were Indo Europeans. I don't believe Yamnaya is their ancestor. Therefore, I don't believe Yamnaya is the ancestor of all Indo Europeans. It's very simple. I think there's a good chance that Yamnaya is the ancestor of all other Indo Europeans. I just don't believe that they're the ancestor of corded ware. This is also what leads me to believe what I mentioned a few moments ago, which is that corded ware is a second source of Indo European languages. Because if I'm right that Yamnaya is not their ancestor, I must inevitably conclude that corded ware is its own independent group of Kurgans, its own source of Indo European languages. So I'm not just trying to disprove the Harvard Lab's theory in this video, I'm also trying to replace it with my own new theory, which claims that Indo European languages come from two Kurgan tribes, Yamnaya and corded ware. And this new theory of mine makes an interesting change to the storyline of how Indo European languages spread. Not just because I have two sources instead of one. The storyline in my theory is not the same as the Harvard Lab, but with two sources. No. When you add corded ware as a second source, it changes the whole storyline. And I'll explain why later in this video. But I can't do that now because before I do, I need to first disprove the Harvard Lab's theory by proving that Yamnaya is not corded ware's ancestor. Well, actually, before I do that, to give context to my argument, I want to explain why the Harvard Lab believes that Yamnaya is corded ware's ancestor. I want to do this first also because they have a good reason, and it's a part of my understanding of the relationship between Yamnaya and corded ware. So to understand my theory, you do have to understand the reason why the Harvard Lab believes that Yamnaya is corded ware's ancestor. Okay, yeah, they do have a good reason. The reason the Harvard Lab believes that Yamnaya is the ancestor of corded ware is that, in terms of overall ancestry, corded ware is basically identical to Yamnaya, which is the exact type of evidence you look for that one people comes from another. It's that their DNA is the same, and corded ware's DNA does indeed look the same to Yamnaya's DNA in terms of its overall ancestry. The main difference which exists between them is that corded ware has significant Neolithic farmland mixture. On average, corded ware DNA samples have 25% Neolithic farmland mixture. It varies from individual to individual. But this difference is not because corded ware comes from a different type of Kurgan population. It's because they absorbed the Neolithic farmers in Northern Europe when their ancestors moved there from the steppe. But if you ignore this Neolithic farmer and mixture in corded ware, it's clear that they derive from a Kurgan steppe population that was not just related to, not just part of the same race as Yamnaya, but practically identical to Yamnaya. And this is what has led the Harvard Lab for the past 7 years to believe that corded ware is derived from Yamnaya. And actually, we don't have to imagine what an unmixed corded ware person would look like because we do have several corded ware DNA samples with no Neolithic farmland mixture. That's right. This is something interesting that many of you guys who study this topic don't know. We have several corded ware DNA samples with no Neolithic farmland mixture. They date to the beginning of the corded ware period. Their ancestors they or their parents had probably just arrived in the north from the steppe, and we can compare them directly to Yamnaya people on the steppe, and yeah, they're basically exactly the same. So it confirms to us that corded ware does derive from a steppe population that was basically the same as Yamnaya. However, there is a slight difference between them, but it's like the difference between people of the same ethnic group from different provinces. So what the Harvard Lab and what those who argue corded ware derived from Yamnaya argue is that this is just because corded ware derives from Yamnaya people of a specific province, not because corded ware is a different Kurgan population, which is a good argument because the Yamnaya culture was absolutely huge. It existed across the whole Eurasian steppe, and you're going to expect there to be some variation between different provinces of the Yamnaya culture. Also, this is a good argument because our published Yamnaya DNA samples, which we compare corded ware to, do not come from the provinces of the Yamnaya culture that you would expect corded ware to come from if corded ware came from Yamnaya. They come from Russia and the Asian branch of Yamnaya, which lived all the way in Mongolia, named Alfanazva. These are not the provinces of the Yamnaya culture where cordware would come from if cordware came from Yamnaya. If cordware came from Yamnaya, you would expect them to come from Ukraine or maybe further west in Hungary. And we have basically no published Yamnaya DNA samples from those locations. And so what the Harvard lab and other people who believe cordware is derived from Yamnaya argue is that if we did, we would find that those Yamnaya people are exactly the same as cordware, and therefore are cordware's direct ancestor. All right, yeah, that is a good argument that the Harvard lab makes, that Yamnaya is cordware's ancestor. But obviously, I disagree. I do not believe that this proves that Yamnaya is cordware's ancestor. It's not because I don't believe that cordware is close enough to Yamnaya in terms of overall ancestry to be from Yamnaya. They certainly are. It's because cordware has different Y DNA than Yamnaya. Y DNA is the chromosome in men's DNA, which is passed down along the direct paternal line from father to son to grandson down to eternity. Now, you might be wondering, how can cordware have different Y DNA than Yamnaya if in terms of overall ancestry, they're basically the same? Well, it's because Y DNA comes from a different part of DNA than overall ancestry. Overall ancestry comes from the 23 chromosomes which we inherit from all of our ancestors, while Y DNA is a chromosome that only exists in men, which comes from only from direct paternal ancestors. There's usually a correlation between Y DNA and overall ancestry, but there doesn't have to be because there are different parts of DNA which are inherited differently. So yeah, in terms of overall ancestry, in terms of the 23 chromosomes, Yamnaya and cordware, for all intentions and purposes, are the same. But in terms of Y DNA, the men of the Yamnaya culture and the men of the cordware culture belong to mutually exclusive different lineages. Corded ware men belong to the Y lineages R1A M417 and R1B L51. Yamnaya men belong to the Y lineage R1B Z2103. This is why I believe that Yamnaya is not cordware's ancestor. The R1B Z2103 in Yamnaya can't become the R1A M417 and R1B L51 in cordware. You know what I mean? Like, it can't make a left turn and become a different lineage. That's not how Y DNA works. Now, I'm guessing that you're noticing that one of the cordware's lineages is an R1B lineage, just as Yamnaya's Y DNA is R1B. However, it is not derived from Yamnaya's R1B. It is best described as a brother. They split from a common ancestor sometime in the 4000s BC. So this is not evidence that cordware comes from Yamnaya. It's just a byproduct of the fact that, as I explained, that cordware and Yamnaya were very, very closely related Kurgan populations. I believe two different tribes of the same Proto-Indo European ethnic group. And I mean, guys, to understand this, you need to understand that literally almost all Yamnaya men belong to the R1B Z2103 lineage, and literally almost all cordware men belong to the R1A M417 or R1B L51 lineage, which means that cordware men and Yamnaya men basically all belong to different male lineages. There's no Y DNA overlap between them. There is one cordware man who belongs to R1B Z2103 that we have documented, and there is one Yamnaya man, believe it or not, among the Yamnaya people in Asia, far away from cordware, that we have documented with R1B L51, but they're a small minority. Overall, there's basically no Y DNA overlap between cordware and Yamnaya, which makes it impossible to model Yamnaya as cordware's ancestor. And the Harvard lab understands this. They don't argue that Yamnaya is cordware's ancestor, even though Yamnaya has different Y DNA than cordware. What the Harvard lab and just people who believe that Yamnaya is cordware's ancestor argue is that not all Yamnaya men had R1B Z2103. They argue that there was a specific Yamnaya population in a specific province of the Yamnaya culture that had cordware's Y DNA and is cordware's direct ancestor, which is a fair argument because, like I mentioned earlier, the Yamnaya DNA we have published is limited to areas where you would not expect cordware's ancestors could not have come from if cordware came from Yamnaya. Our published Yamnaya DNA only comes from, like I said, Russia and Asia, which is not where cordware's ancestors would come from if cordware came from Yamnaya. Cordware's ancestors, you would expect, would come from the western parts of Yamnaya's territory if they came from Yamnaya. And so it's totally plausible to say if we had ancient DNA, lots of ancient DNA from Yamnaya people in the western parts of its territory, we would not find R1BZ2103. We would find the Y DNA ancestral to corded ware. But we do have news of unpublished Y DNA from Yamnaya men in its western territories, and the news we've gotten is that they basically all carry R1BZ2103, just like published Yamnaya males further east. The studies these Western Yamnaya Y DNA samples come from are not yet published because they're still in the works. They come from two teams of researchers. One of them, surprise, surprise, the Harvard lab. The other one is a university in Hungary. The university in Hungary, they revealed, they leaked Y DNA results of their Yamnaya males in Hungary in a PowerPoint presentation that they did online. I have a link in the description to an image of that PowerPoint presentation showing Western Yamnaya Y DNA results specifically in Hungary. And if you look at it, you'll see it shows that basically 100% of them belong to R1bZ2103. And then for the Harvard lab, it was a researcher from their lab, specifically the famous archaeologist David Anthony, who revealed in an interview at Razib Khan's podcast that their Western Yamnaya males in Hungary and I believe also Slovakia, but it was another Western Yamnaya country, belonged to R1bZ2103. And he explicitly said none of them belong to the quarter-ware version of R1A. And I presume also not the quarter-ware version of R1B, but he didn't say that explicitly. Anyways, then my third source, I have a third source for unpublished Western Yamnaya Y DNA. It's a personal source. It's somebody that I know named Davitsky. He runs an awesome blog called the Eurogenes blog. This is the main blog that I discuss and study ancient DNA at. And Davitsky, he's in contact with some researchers at the Harvard lab, and he tells me that they have shown him lots of the Y DNA results of their Western Yamnaya males. And what he tells me is that basically all of them have R1bZ2103, and he told me explicitly that none of them have the quarter-ware Y DNA haplogroups, the R1A M417 and R1B L51. If what these sources say about this unpublished Western Yamnaya DNA is correct, it would mean that all Yamnaya men across the whole Eurasian steppe, stretching from Hungary in the west to Mongolia in the east, pretty much all of them just belong to R1B Z2103. Now, understandably, I know that some of you are going to be skeptical of what these sources say about this unpublished data. You're probably thinking, we should just wait till it's published. These sources might be reading the data wrong. We should just wait till it's published to know for sure that it shows that the Western Yamnaya males also belong to R1bZ2103. I think you should trust them. I'm not going to give you a long argument for why you should trust them because that would be a waste of time. I'll just leave it at that and say that this is the last of my evidence that Yamnaya had different Y DNA than quarter-ware and therefore cannot be quarter-ware's ancestor, and therefore that the Harvard Lab's theory that Yamnaya is the ancestor of all Indo Europeans is wrong. And it would also prove that, like I mentioned earlier, that quarter-ware is a second source of Indo European languages. Because, as I explained earlier, if quarter-ware does not descend from Yamnaya, it inevitably means that quarter-ware was its own group of Kurgans and is therefore its own source of Indo European languages, and therefore that Indo European languages come from two groups of Kurgans, Yamnaya and quarter-ware. This is what my new theory claims. I'll explain it to you in detail in a few moments, but before I do, I actually need to say something else about Y DNA. I need to explain something to you that you need to understand how Y DNA truly makes Yamnaya and quarter-ware into two different Indo-European tribes. So I already explained to you that Y DNA is a genetic marker, and any genetic marker which exists in basically all Yamnaya people, but not in basically all quarter-ware people, would prove that Yamnaya is not quarter-ware's ancestor. Any genetic marker would do this, not just Y DNA. But the thing you need to understand is that for Kurgans, Y DNA was not just any other genetic marker. It was the genetic marker. It was the genetic marker that made them who they were. This is because Kurgan tribes were quite literally Y DNA tribes. The technical term is paternal tribes, but Y DNA tribe means the same thing, and it conveys the message better. They were units of people who all had the same Y DNA, the same paternal lineage. Really, the way to explain it is they were like big families in which all the children came from the same father. And being from him is what made them family members together. He's what made them a family. He's what made them a tribe. The tribe of Isaac, the tribe of Benjamin. This is literally what Kurgan tribes were. No hyperbole. This is literally what they were because these Y DNA lineages that they had did ultimately trace back to one man who most likely did found their tribes in the same way that an Isaac and a Benjamin did. So Yamnaya was the tribe of R1bZ2103, the children of R1bZ2103. A Yamnaya person, by definition, was a person who descended from this man, from this lineage. Okay, now when you understand this and you look again and see that quarter-ware does not carry R1bZ2103, it gives you a more vivid understanding of why this means quarter-ware is not of the Yamnaya tribe. When you viewed Y DNA as just one of many genetic markers, your reaction was probably, oh, Yamnaya and Ware were basically the same. They just differed in this one genetic marker. You also probably thought there's somehow got to be a way around this. There's somehow got to be a way to make Yamnaya Ware's ancestor, even though they had different Y DNA. But now your reaction should be, oh my goodness, they have different Y DNA? Y DNA? You're talking about Y DNA? This definitely means Ware does not come from Yamnaya. Discussion over. That's my reaction to it, to their Y DNA difference. And that should now be your reaction. Also, when you see again that Ware has its own Y DNA, you should have a vivid understanding that Ware was its own Indo European tribe. Really, they were composed of two tribes because they had two Y DNAs, the R1A M417 tribe and the R1B L51 tribe. Okay, what my view and my theory is that Yamnaya and Ware were founded by different men of the same Proto-Indo European ethnic group. This Proto-Indo European ethnic group that they both come from, I think would have been a unified community sometime between 3500 and 4500 BC. My guess is that they are what archaeologists call the Surdny Stog culture, which existed at the borderlands between modern-day Ukraine and Russia during that time. And yeah, I think one man from this community founded the Yamnaya tribe, and two other men from this community founded the Ware tribes. This explains why they're basically the same in overall ancestry, but have different Y DNA. They're the same in overall ancestry because they come from the same Proto-Indo European ethnic group, but they have different Y DNA because they come from different men of that ethnic group. See what I mean? See how that explains why it's confusing how they have the same overall ancestry but have different Y DNA? And I mean, the Harvard Lab is right in concluding that the fact they have the same overall ancestry means they are of the same people, but not in the sense that one comes from another. It's because they are two different tribes of the same people. The Proto-Indo Europeans. That's the people they are the two tribes of. All right. Now I guess I'll just tell you in short what my new theory is. It's really short. What my new theory is that Indo-European languages were spread by two different Indo-European tribes, Yamnaya and Ware. Each one of them took different migration routes across two different geographic zones. Yamnaya went across the Eurasian steppe zone, and Ware went across the forest zone of northern Europe. They both became the masters of these zones, and then from these zones, they would spread to all the other places that Indo-European languages exist. But really, it was just Ware that did that. For the most part, Yamnaya just stayed in the steppe. Okay, I just told you what my new theory is. It's very short and simple, and it does in fact make a significant change from the storyline in the Harvard Lab's theory. I've been telling you that this whole video, and now I'll finally explain to you how it does. It doesn't just make a change because I have two sources instead of one. When you include Ware as a second source, it changes the storyline. It specifically changes the storyline of the migration routes that Indo-Europeans took, which is important. In the Harvard Lab's theory, the storyline is that before the Indo-Europeans migrated anywhere else, they first migrated across the Eurasian steppe because they had a new type of nomadic pastoralism that allowed them to live on it and spread across it unlike anyone else had before. They mastered it. They became the steppe people. And then from the steppe, they migrated to other places. And that's how Indo-European languages spread. But in my theory, because I view Ware as its own separate Kurgan tribe, the spread of Indo-European languages doesn't begin in just the steppe, in just one region. It begins in two regions, the steppe, but also northern Europe. It begins with two different Kurgan tribes who migrated across two different geographic zones. One who migrated across the Eurasian steppe, Yamnaya, and one who migrated across the forest zone of northern Europe, Ware. And then from there, they would migrate to all the other places that Indo-European languages have been spoken in. The reason why the Harvard Lab and the Harvard Lab's theory, the spread begins only in the steppe, is because they believe Yamnaya is the ancestor of Ware, the ancestor of all Indo-Europeans. So they view Ware's northern expansion as a successor to an earlier expansion on the steppe. But in my theory, because I view Ware as its own independent Kurgan tribe, I view its northern expansion as its own independent expansion, not a successor to an earlier expansion on the steppe. Now, I know you guys who study this topic have a skeptical look on your face right now. I just know it. You're probably like, okay, Sam, you're trying to make too much of a change, and you're making a mistake. You're probably thinking, even if your theory is correct, it does not change the narrative that the spread of Indo-Europeans began on the steppe and then went to other regions. Because the Kurgan race originated on the steppe. It was not just Yamnaya who came from the steppe, all Indo Europeans did. Ware's ancestors came to the north from the steppe. Just because even if they don't come from Yamnaya, they still come from the steppe. Within the framework of your theory, with Ware being its own separate source of Indo European languages, everything still traces back, everything still begins in the steppe. That's a good point that you guys make. Actually, it's not just a good point. You're right. My theory does not totally disprove this narrative that the spread of Indo European languages began on the steppe, because the Indo Europeans themselves, as you said, were native to the steppe. So it does all begin on the steppe. But in the Harvard Lab's theory, when they say the spread began in the steppe, they mean more than it began with a race of people who were native to a part of the steppe. They mean it began with a tribe who ruled the whole Eurasian steppe. The Kurgan race did not naturally rule the whole Eurasian steppe. They were not native to the whole Eurasian steppe. They were only native to a specific section of it. And when the Harvard Lab says the spread began in the steppe, they don't mean that it began with a race of people native to a specific section of the steppe. They mean it began with a tribe of people who were roaming the whole Eurasian steppe, who were the masters of the whole Eurasian steppe, and then moved out. And I mean, this is a really powerful storyline about the spread of Indo-European languages. It's epitomized in how David Anthony, in the subtitle of his 2007 book, describes the Indo Europeans. He describes them as, or he says, his book is going to tell you how Bronze Age writers of the Eurasian steppe shaped the modern world. And that description of Indo Europeans creates this story of these people who are roaming the whole Eurasian steppe on their horses. They're the masters of the region, and then they go to other places, and that's how Indo European languages spread. This is a really powerful narrative, but it only works if Yamnaya is the ancestor of all Indo Europeans, because Yamnaya were the only Kurgans who truly fit that description of steppe people. Kurgans, yes, they were a race native to the steppe, but there are specific characteristics or specific aspects of the definition of steppe people that the Harvard Lab uses that only applies to a specific Kurgan tribe called Yamnaya. They're the only one who mastered the whole Eurasian steppe. They're the only one with this cool type of nomadic pastoralism that allowed them to spread across the steppe. So when I make Yamnaya not to be Ware's ancestor, it destroys this narrative that that's who the Indo Europeans were. It makes it so that was just one particular Indo European tribe doing their own thing. They were not Ware's ancestor. They were not the ancestor of all Indo Europeans. Ware's ancestors probably came from southwestern Ukraine. They were not people roaming the whole Eurasian steppe. This narrative that the Harvard Lab gives for Ware's origin is that they come from this tribe of people who are roaming the whole Eurasian steppe. They were the steppe people, and when you realize, I think I've done enough to prove to you that Yamnaya is not Ware's ancestor, you realize that debunks that whole narrative. Yes, Ware is a close relative of Yamnaya, but that doesn't give you an excuse for saying that they are a part of a people who roam the whole Eurasian steppe. Their specific tribe was not doing that. It was a different tribe that was doing that. So, it's inaccurate to describe Ware and all the Indo-European languages that come from them as coming from these Eurasian steppe people. They were a different Kurgan tribe that went in a different direction. They chose to become a master of a different region, the forest zone of Northern Europe. And in my theory, their expansion across Northern Europe, their mastering of the forest zone is just as important as Yamnaya's mastering of the Eurasian steppe zone. I see them as parallel expansions, brother expansions. I see Indo-Europeans as coming from these two different Kurgan tribes who can be linked to two different habitats, two different geographic zones. One, the forest zone of Northern Europe. One, the steppe zone, or the Eurasian steppe zone. In other words, it's not all about the Eurasian steppe in my theory, just as it's not all about Yamnaya. That's what happens when you view Ware as a equal to Yamnaya. And I find it interesting that these two ancestors of Indo-Europeans settled exclusively in two different habitats. Like, they didn't just settle in different regions with different territories. They settled in areas that had different habitats. Like the areas that Ware settled in Northern Europe were exclusively forest zone, and the areas that Yamnaya settled in Eurasia were exclusively steppe zone. I found this interesting because it was definitely not on accident. There's a reason behind this. They wanted to live in different habitats from each other. It's almost as if they were communicating with each other. They definitely were, and saying okay, I'll take the forest zone, you take the steppe zone. They're brother tribes. They're both super powerful. They're able to conquer these areas from other people, and they decide to divide what land each one took. And something interesting I suspect is that this was not a consensual agreement, that it was actually Yamnaya that forced Ware out of the steppe, because Ware appeared in the forest zone of Northern Europe
right at the tail end of Yamnaya's expansion across the steppe, right when Yamnaya took over the part of the steppe that their ancestors lived in. It was in 3000 BC. It was right when Yamnaya moved into southwestern Ukraine, Romania area. And I think that's where Corduware's ancestors came from. And it's at that moment when it seems to me that they kicked Corduware's ancestors out of that area of the steppe and forced them to go into the forested areas further north. And I have a funny cartoon depicting this scenario.
Hey, brother, listen to me. You must get out of here. You must leave the steppe and go to the north. But why? I like living in the steppe. Because the steppe belongs to me. There's only room for one Kurgan tribe here, and that's me, Yamnaya. There's no room for you, so you must leave and go to the north. But brother, the forests in the north make it crowded. I don't think there's enough space for me to herd my cattle and my horses. Just cut down the trees and make room. Oh yeah, I guess. But brother, there's already a lot of people living in the north. Globular amphora, funnel beaker, Narva, Volasova. There's no room for Kurgans there. Well, just conquer them and take the land from them. Oh yeah, I guess. Yes, I am surprised I have to explain this to you, my own brother. Okay, sure. Agreed. I'll go to the north and leave the steppe to you. You're being really hostile anyways. And I don't feel like living here and having to fight with you over the steppe. So, yeah, I'll go to the north. Agreed. Okay, good. Now leave. Get out of here. Go to the north.
I'm not seriously claiming that Yamnaya bossed Corduware around like that, but even if they did, it doesn't matter. Because in the end, Corduware became greater than Yamnaya. That's right. Corduware became greater than Yamnaya because they ended up spreading Indo European languages over a much wider expanse of land than Yamnaya did. This, you can say, is a second way in which my theory's storyline is a change from that in the Harvard Lab's theory. When you include Corduware as a second source, it automatically makes Yamnaya the lesser of the two sources. Here's a map of Indo European languages. The languages shaded in red, I believe, come from Corduware, and the languages shaded in green, I think, probably come from Yamnaya. I base which come from Corduware and which come from Yamnaya on Y DNA. I am 100% confident that the languages shaded in red come from Corduware based on ancient Y DNA, and I am pretty confident that the languages shaded in green come from Yamnaya based on modern Y DNA. I'm less confident because it's based on modern Y DNA, not ancient Y DNA. And as you can see, the languages derived from Corduware cover a much wider expansive land, So Corduware is a greater ancestor of Indo European languages than Yamnaya. Now, why is this? Why did things end up like this? Well, it's because Corduware had two descendants who made huge expansions outside of its territory in northern Europe, while Yamnaya didn't have any descendants who made huge expansions out of the steppe. Yamnaya did have descendants who made expansions out of the steppe, but none of them made huge expansions like these two descendants of Corduware. These two descendants of Corduware are Belbeeker and the Aryans. Belbeeker expanded west, they carried a derived form of Corduware's R1b. And the Aryans expanded east and carried a derived form of Corduware's R1a. The Aryans are known widely by their archaeological cultures, Sarubna, Santashta, and Andronova, but I like to use one word to refer to all of them, Aryans. Anyways, when you include Corduware with his two descendants on a map, you can see that it includes those areas that were shaded in red that I claim Corduware-derived languages existed. So this is the main reason why Corduware is the source of most Indo-European languages. And by the way, whether or not Corduware is a descendant of Yamnaya or not is irrelevant to this point. Corduware would still be the source of most Indo-European languages. It is undeniable that Corduware is the ancestor of Belbeeker and the Aryans. It's because it's based on ancient Y DNA. Remember, Y DNA is the genetic marker of Kurgan tribes, and the Aryans and Belbeeker both carry Corduware-derived forms of Y DNA. So it's undeniable they are Corduware's descendants. I explained this in the first video of my series, actually, which I posted way back last September, 9 months ago. And it's something the Harvard Lab has not figured out yet, which is why I made a video about it. It's fundamental to the Indo-European story, the fact that Corduware is the source of most Indo-European languages. It's frustrating that the Harvard Lab hasn't figured it out yet. It's why I made, like I said, why I made that first video. If Yamnaya is Corduware's ancestor, it would not change this. It would just mean that Corduware is a descendant of Yamnaya, who is the source of most of the Indo-European languages that come from Yamnaya. Anyways, of course, I don't think Corduware is a descendant of Yamnaya. I think they're a separate group who's the source of most Indo European languages. Anyways, yeah, Yamnaya did not have any descendants who made huge expansions out of the steppe like this. They did have some descendants who made expansions out of the steppe. For example, based on modern Y DNA, we know for a fact that Yamnaya people did migrate south of the Caucasus into the Middle East and are the source of the Armenian language. But this was probably not a massive migration like what the Corduware descendants Belbeeker and the Aryans did. Yamnaya seems to have been content with mostly just staying in the steppe. Some of them did go south of the Caucasus, some of them did go further south in Europe, but most of them just stayed in the steppe. And this is in huge contrast to how the Harvard lab talks about Yamnaya. They describe the Yamnaya's expansion out of the steppe as just the precursor to huge expansions out of the steppe. But it seems that Yamnaya's end goal was just to live across the steppe, and that was it. It was really just Ware who wanted to go everywhere else. Another reason why Ware ended up becoming greater than Yamnaya is because the eastern Ware descendant, the Aryans, replaced Yamnaya on the steppe. That's right. I told you the Aryans migrated east out of northern Europe, and the place they migrated east into was the Eurasian steppe. They would right afterwards go into southern Asia. That's the migration they're most well known for because that's where their languages are spoken today. But the main area they originally went to was the Eurasian steppe. So in essence, they represent Ware people returning to the steppe and replacing their Yamnaya brothers who were living there. Pretty fascinating. I've not really heard anyone else point this out before. Lots of people talk about the Aryans. They're really important in archaeology. They invented the spoked wheels chariot. They are the source of the modern domestic horse breed. But people don't talk about how when they moved into the steppe, they were already Indo Europeans living there. Yamnaya drive Indo Europeans, and so they had to replace them. This is why in historical times, the Indo European language branch which was spoken in the Eurasian steppe was Iranian, not a branch derived from Yamnaya. This is a fascinating twist to the Indo European story. It means part of the reason why Ware became greater is they eventually went head on against Yamnaya and beat them. And I made a funny cartoon depicting this scenario, which is a successor to the first cartoon I made where Yamnaya was bullying Ware, and now Ware comes back and gets revenge.
Why, hello, brother. Long time no see. Ware, what the hell are you doing on the steppe? Well, I've grown tired of living in the north. There are so many trees that it leaves me little room to ride my horses. So, I've decided to come back home to the steppe land, where it's much more spacious. Brother, you know full well that the steppe is my land. When you left, you even agreed to respect my claim to it. You seem to have forgotten that our agreement has an expiration date. See? Look, it expires June 14th, 2000 BC. That's today. So your claim is no longer legitimate. Ah, you tricked me. I do not remember seeing an expiration date. I didn't trick you. You just had a bad lawyer. Now move aside, brother. The steppe belongs to me now. You are going to have to take it from my cold, dead hands. Ah! You son of a bitch! How could you do this to your fellow Kurgan? Ah! Hey, brother, listen to me. You must get out of here. You must leave the steppe and go to the north. But why? I like living in the steppe. Because the steppe belongs to me. There's only room for one Kurgan tribe here, and that's me, Yamnaya. There's no room for you, so you must leave and go to the north. But brother, the forests in the north make it crowded. I don't think there's enough space for me to herd my cattle and my horses. Just cut down the trees and make room. Oh yeah, I guess. But brother, there's already a lot of people living in the north. Globular Amphora, Funnelbeaker, Narva, Volasova. There's no room for Kurgans there. Well, just conquer them and take the land from them. Oh yeah, I guess. Yes, I'm surprised I have to explain this to you, my own brother. Okay, sure. Agreed. I'll go to the north and leave the steppe to you. You're being really hostile anyways. And I don't feel like living here and having to fight with you over the steppe. So, yeah, I'll go to the north. Agreed. Okay, good. Now leave. Get out of here. Go to the north.